Hey guys, I'm Alex from Sanzu Fabrications, and in this video I'm going to show you how I patterned and constructed Marth's Tunic for my Marth Cosplay series. Let me preface this by saying I am not a tailor. I have very basic sewing skills and I often have trouble with patterns. In Marth's artwork, he wears a tunic or cloak, with both heavy Asian and European influences. I didn't bother to look for a pre-made pattern because the garment looked relatively simple. Instead, I decided to draft my own pattern using the same technique I used for creating armor. I started by wrapping my dress form in plastic wrap and covering that in masking tape. Fortunately for me, my dress form is very similar in size and shape to myself, so I could make a fitted garment and not worry too much about it being the wrong size. It took a little bit of patience to make the sleeves, but eventually I got it right. I also changed the collar from the reference pictures too. I changed the square collar to a rounded mandarin collar, because I knew the corners would bug me while I was wearing the outfit. Once I was happy with the template, I drew on where my seams would be. To get the locations right, I just looked at one of my colored shirts and copied those. To keep the pattern symmetrical, I only cut out half of it. I then cut out the shapes along the lines and moved on to making a mock-up. I knew I wanted to test my pattern, so I was sure to buy several yards of muslin. Muslin is an inexpensive material that you can use to draft and test your patterns. Whenever possible, I suggest making a mock-up first. To make my mock-up, I traced my pattern onto the muslin. I made sure to add an extra ½ inch all around as a seam allowance. Once I had all the pieces cut out, I quickly sewed them together. I went so quickly, in fact, that I didn't even bother changing the thread in my machine. You probably noticed my pattern is only shirt length. I didn't bother making the mock-up knee length for two reasons. One, I didn't want to use extra fabric, and two, I didn't need to test the length. I'm glad I went through all the trouble of making a mock-up, because it revealed two problems with my pattern. The collar was too short to reach all the way around the neck, and the seams underneath the sleeves didn't line up. Those were pretty easy to fix, so I didn't bother repatterning the whole thing. To make sure both the lining and the outside of the tunic matched, I traced my pattern onto the darker fabric for the lining and added the ½ inch seam allowance, and then traced those pieces onto the lighter blue fabric. I forgot to buy a gray fabric for the sleeves, so I just doubled up some of the leftover muslin and cut it into rectangles for each sleeve. In the reference pictures, these gray areas are obviously the lining of Marth's rolled up sleeves, but as someone who rolls up their sleeves, I can tell you that getting actual lined sleeves up that high makes them very bulky and very uncomfortable. It was at this point that I made sure to correct the mistakes on my sleeve and collar patterns that I found during my mock-up. With all the pieces cut out, it was time to sew. I started by sewing all the lining pieces together and all of the outer pieces together, making two separate garments. I then went back and sewed the two halves together along the outer seams. It may not seem like much work, but in the time it took to sew, I watched full cutscene movies of Final Fantasy XV, Fire Emblem Awakening, BioShock, and half of Final Fantasy X. Overall, it probably took me over 25 hours. If you're sewing for long periods of time, make sure you take breaks. Sewing while tired leads to mistakes. For example, I forgot to buy a zipper, so I went through all my sewing stuff and found one in the exact color and length I needed. I attached it to the garment and... that's right, I didn't check to make sure it was a separating zipper. So I got to spend a lot of time picking out all of those stitches in order to remove it. I also accidentally sewed the sleeves together into a loop, and had to go back and undo all of that too. Once the main garment was finally put together, I stitched on an upholstery trim for the gold borders. I used this because I wanted to add a little more detail than the plain gold trim shown in the references. My plan was to hand stitch it on, but after about 20 minutes of stitching and making little progress, I threw some dark blue thread into my machine and machine stitched it. The dark blue thread is almost invisible on the lining, so it worked out. And after hours of work, I had my first garment put together from scratch. It looks a bit weird though, having a brand new tunic under old dingy armor, so the next step is going to be aging and weathering the tunic to make it look older and lived in. That will have to wait for the next video though. If you've drafted your own clothing patterns for a costume, then let me know what it was for in the comments. And if you want to see how this costume turns out, then be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.